So here we are, either here or there. If I wasn't among the lucky people that have some health problem that we want to play it really safe, I'd probably be there in the hall with the rest of you, or most of you. And I hope at this juncture, despite how long this all may go on, I hope that you're all having a very good Sabbath day. Having said that, however, I am most likely going to throw a wrench into it for a little while. And of course, I'll be explaining that as we go. So to jump right in, let me make a statement, a couple of statements, see where that leaves us. What if I said you can't keep the Sabbath? Or you're not keeping the Sabbath? Any problem with a statement like that? Are you wondering, what's this guy been smoking? Or, oh, rather, the isolation's finally gotten to him and he's gone over the edge. And that one I think I'll leave alone for now. And I'm not really talking about our lockdown these past many months either, though that figures into it a bit, and we'll come to that later on. First of all, to allay your minds, hopefully damp down some fears for statements like that, I'm also not talking about the day of the week. The seventh-day Sabbath is among the easiest things to prove that there is. And you don't really have to go any farther than the Catholic Encyclopedia, of all places, to read in their articles through the years that the seventh-day Sabbath is the only scriptural Sabbath. They just claim a higher authority to change the day. And you and I respectfully disagree. So I'm not talking about the day. So then what am I saying? And of course, I have to spend the rest of my time explaining it. First, a qualification or two. For the first part of this message, I'll be speaking mostly about technicalities or legalities as far as the Bible goes, as far as world history goes, and how that relates to how we keep the Sabbath day. Now, it's the spirit of it that really matters. And we'll get to that in the last part of the message. But I need to use a more black and white focus up front to get across certain necessary points. So bear with me on this. I'm going to rehearse several things that we may already know, maybe we don't, or maybe we've just forgotten, passed over them, haven't considered them, when it comes to how and whether we're really keeping the Sabbath day as God designed it. Critical point there in the way that's worded. And like most things, we can usually tell, to borrow a phrase from Jesus, by the fruits, by whether something is working for us the way it should. That's always the test on almost anything in life. So let's start out this way. Do we have a problem with the Sabbath? Is it working? Now, I say that because through the years, I've lost count of the number of people in the church who have confessed, always on the sly, that they're quite often exhausted by the end of the Sabbath. And during my working years, I could say the same thing. In fact, even well retired as I am now, when we were meeting regularly, I could have said almost the same thing. It sometimes seems a very long, exhausting grind. we now call normal times, what's the usual routine? And maybe those of you in the hall today experienced some of this. You get up, you get ready for services, you hit the road, perhaps endure an hour or perhaps more of frenetic, crazy traffic. You arrive, visit for a while, sit through the services, visit a little longer, maybe there's another meeting or an activity. By the time it's all done, finally you make your way home, and by the time it's done, you've put in the equivalent of a full day's work without any union breaks along the way. And for those of you with a boatload of children, that goes double or triple. At times, and I don't mean all the time, but sometimes, the day seems far removed from the comment in Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 13, where it says that we should see the Sabbath as a delight. And what does that verse really mean? And we'll get to that. No wonder some people have confessed to finding it all exhausting. And worse, we then have to use Sunday to catch up on the rest we need to start another work week, which seems to defeat the whole purpose, doesn't it? We end up trading the mad dash of the work week for the mad dash of the Sabbath. Some of you perhaps haven't found it that way yet. Your day's coming. In short, the question needs to be asked, do we really believe, do we really think that this modern routine of ours is what God intended when he instituted the Sabbath as a day of true rest and refreshment to nurture his people? We need to explore that just a bit. Even the word Sabbath, as we use it, has within it a meaning we need to acknowledge, and just perhaps use as a guide in the way that we choose to keep it. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew term, or the Hebrew word used for Sabbath, most often used, simply means an intermission. Now think of that in terms of movies, and you realize it's a complete break from what was just happening. It's a timeout. You've accomplished the work of 1 week. Now there's a timeout before the next week arrives. In the New Testament, the Greek word for Sabbath means even more. Primarily, it means a day of weekly repose from secular avocations. That's the formal translation. And it means a break from our jobs or careers, of course, but it also implies our hobbies and amusements. In short, a total break from what usually occupies our daily lives. But then go and look up the word repose. Take it further. And it gets even deeper, because it's not just saying rest. The meaning includes a total rest, a complete cessation from effort. Is that what we're experiencing? Or someone might ask, how do we do that? I'll get to that part of the problem as we go. In our modern world, we definitely have a problem with even the concept of rest. Some company, and maybe you've seen the ads on TV, has come up with a computer app or something for your phone that reminds you to just stop everything for a moment and rest and breathe. And that's actually a very good idea for an app. But how desperate are we that we have to have our computers reminding us to take a break? We don't realize how wound up we are in this world. Perhaps these last months have given us a hint. Years ago, I used an example from early American history to show how far we have come, or perhaps devolved, to give us some perspective. And that was an event that happened in the early 1800s when trade from the Great Lakes had to use laborious overland routes to get to the Hudson Valley and then down to New York City to sell those goods. Some bright person came up with the idea of cutting a canal through the middle of New York State, directly from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. That way barge traffic could erase the toil of the overland route. Realize these barges, what came to be called the Erie Canal, were very simple affairs pulled by horses or donkeys on the shore, moving at a simple walking pace. How fast do horses or donkeys walk? But it wasn't as simple for the residents along the route. They were up in arms. They protested, claiming, and this is not a joke, claiming that this new barge route would increase the speed of life to an unacceptable degree. We can't even imagine that mindset now. In our advanced, fast-paced modern world where everything is moving at light speed, we can't even imagine slowing down to that point. Rest? What's that? And yet God's original command for the Sabbath, burned into the whole meaning that anyone has ever known of it, buried in the name of the day, ordained a complete rest. And the fullness of that rest actually becomes a matter of the Spirit, which I said I'll address a little later. So like the salesman say, wait, there's more. Because God also commanded a gathering on the Sabbath. We know that. Evidently as part of that total rest. But how does that work? And again, we need some perspective. I doubt we really need to turn to Leviticus or Deuteronomy to review God's commands to Israel on coming together on the Sabbath day. Those are easy to look up. He wants his family to join together. It's very obvious. We know that in the New Testament, that same concept is reflected, that God's people should come together, it says, and not neglect it. Though that term, not neglecting the meeting together, doesn't just apply to the Sabbath, and again, that's for a little later. And as that also comes under the heading of matters of the Spirit, I need to wait a while before I get fully into that one. But in our modern world, this all leaves us with a quandary. And we've lived with this for a long time. In our fast-moving lives today, how do we rest on the one hand, and yet come together on the other without frustrating one or both instructions? And let's look at history for a bit and see if it's what we really thought it was, what you think it is. What if what I called our problem isn't our problem? While Israel as a family and nation kept the Sabbath and was still doing it when Jesus walked the earth, This wasn't so easy as time went by. In fact, from the fall of Rome until well into the 20th century, it's the 20th century, it was supremely difficult to keep the seventh-day Sabbath in any way close to what God had ideally intended for his people. For most of history, keeping the Sabbath openly would invite severe persecution, torture, or death. For most of what we have called the church age, and that's 20 centuries, to keep the true Sabbath would have you labeled a heretic and burned at the stake. It had to be kept secretly. And that certainly was not God's intent for the Sabbath. Even in colonial America, you would invite severe punishment or banishment from any community for keeping the true Sabbath day. And working on the Sabbath? Not working on the Sabbath. Forget it. Not working on the Sabbath would make you stick out like a neon sign throughout all these centuries. We forget, as I said, that well into the 20th century, the work week was generally Monday through Saturday, 12 to 16 hours a day, and no legal recourse for your religion. Now that started to turn around with the advent of what came to be called unionism during the late 1800s. Let me read a little blurb from Wikipedia, their article on the work week and the weekend, which said it was in 1908 when the first 5-day work week in the United States was instituted by a New England cotton mill so that Jewish workers would not have to work on the Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. It wasn't until 1926 when Henry Ford cut the working hours of his people, doubled their pay, and gave them a new thing called the weekend. 2 whole days off. And that's when the game started to turn around. A wonderfully ironic twist about this, by the way, is that Ford was evidently anti-Semitic. But giving his workers the Sabbath off along with Sunday, therefore a 2-day weekend, meant happier workers willing to spend more. During the Great Depression of the 30s, it even made economic sense. By having people work fewer hours, you could hire more people to work more shifts. But it wasn't until 1938, that's just before World War II, 1938, that the federal government finally made the 40-hour work week a national standard. And it wasn't until 1964, if you want to orient yourself in history on that one, 1964, 1 year after President John Kennedy was assassinated. 1964. Only then were our so-called religious rights protected by federal law. It was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII. And reading a piece of it here, it prohibits employers from discriminating against individuals because of their religion or lack of religious belief in hiring, firing, or any other terms and conditions of employment. The law also prohibits job segregation based on religion. 1964. Think how recent that actually was. Only since then have any of us had a legal means to protect our livelihood in relation to our religion. And while it's not ironclad, employers will still play games on those things. At least the deck is stacked in our favor. The fight for rights never ceases, but at least it's stacked in our favor. That's the world we live in. That's the world our ancestors had to deal with. To say it bluntly, true Christians aren't really welcome. It's just the way it is. And we can more clearly see from that why the Bible calls Satan the god of this world. We're in the middle of his game. And when you get right down to brass tacks, only God can protect us. So you can see already that God's intent for the Sabbath to be a blessing of peace to the people he calls, it's rarely been possible, even among those who believe. It's not unique to us. This world doesn't allow it. Not then, only barely now, and in some parts of the world, not at all. The actual truth of God's way is not wanted. Even our virus lockdown these many months is just another hurdle with which we have to cope. I'm reviewing all this so you'll know that any difficulty you've ever had or may have in keeping the things of God simply means you're not alone. Uncounted others have had to deal with this struggle and worse throughout all the ages of mankind, and it won't end until Jesus returns. If we today were more like ancient Israel, where everyone kept the Sabbath, then think how differently our lives would be lived and how differently we would keep the Sabbath. How different a day it would be. For one thing, we wouldn't have to commute to a church service. I'm not trying to be funny when I point these things out. If everyone in your neighborhood kept the Sabbath, you would have your rest and your gathering ready-made. It would be more like a block party with neighbors, gathering to share meals, compare notes, encourage one another. In short, more as God intended. In a way, just to use this as an example, those who go or have gone on the yearly men's hike are keeping the day better than we usually do. They're together, they're relaxing, and yet things of God are being discussed, at least we hope they are. They're actually experiencing a Sabbath of rest in the midst of their gathering. When Israel gathered in the wilderness, same story. And in the New Testament period of the first century, as we read about it in the New Testament, most of the congregations of believers were in small areas, each with their own elder. They lived in close proximity to one another. None of this is true today. That's not our world. We're too spread out. The world has evolved. We're prevented by the very world we live in, by our necessary living styles, from gaining the full benefit that God said the Sabbath was to hold. That's why I said at the start, you can't keep the Sabbath, technically speaking. So what do you do? What can you do? In the end, can we gain from what the Sabbath says? Or rather, what the Bible says about the meaning of the Sabbath and how should we be viewing it? And right now, that means exclusively, for the rest of this message, in the New Testament. What does it hold out to us? What are we really looking for? And this switches the talk now from technical to spiritual. Because there are answers to this quandary. Those answers won't change the physical problems we have to face by living in this world. But they do give us a better perspective on where we are with God and where we should be looking, what our priorities need to be, and on what the Sabbath should mean and does mean in a far greater way than we normally take the time to see. First, let's remember the words of Christ when he said in Mark chapter 2 and verse 27, "The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath." The New Bible Commentary adds, "The fourth commandment, like all the rest, was given not for the sake of imposing religious restrictions, but to meet man's physical and spiritual need. It's here to serve us, not the other way around. It's here for our benefit. And there are many benefits we can gain and share." The writer of Hebrews said in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11, "There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest." You should probably look it up, because here the word rest means the repose of Christianity as a type of heaven. Or in other words, that becoming a Christian means that we've already begun to enter that ultimate rest, meaning eternity. The New Bible Commentary summarizes these verses in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 by highlighting the overall point, and they say it so well, I'm just reading this verbatim. "It's clear, therefore, that God intends his people to share his own Sabbath rest. Entrance into it means a cessation from their own works. In its fullness, such a goal is therefore something that lies beyond this life. Yet those who find salvation and new life in Christ do begin to experience it here and now. They have begun to enjoy a blessing which is yet to be consummated. Its possession is both now and not yet." He also referenced Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29, which has Christ saying that if we come to him, we'll find our needful rest. So each Sabbath is a reminder of the coming fullness, the true rest of God. And we should use it, the Bible goes on, to help and encourage each other to endure. Back to Hebrews, this time chapter 10, verses 23 and 20 through 25. "Let us hold fast the confession of our faith without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let's consider how to stir up one another," just means to stimulate and encourage each other, "to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging," which includes the purpose of comforting, "encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." The New Bible Commentary, using the original Greek, expands on this by saying we should take notice of each other's needs so that no one can slip through the cracks and be lost along the way. And therefore, we shouldn't cease to use our assembling as opportunities for mutual encouragement and comfort. And that assembling doesn't simply mean the Sabbath itself, but any and all times that we can meet and gather and share each other's company. Back in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, the commentary underlines that point, again from the original language, saying every day, Christians should speak words of encouragement to one another. The many are responsible for the one. Every member of the Christian community should take care lest any one of their number slips away. So, let's recap. Let's admit, okay, we can't keep the fullness of the Sabbath rest in this time, this age. We're in a battle. And it won't be won until Christ returns. But let's not make the other mistake, which in some ways we have in the past, where it almost seems sometimes that we're worshiping the Sabbath and holy days more than the Creator who gave them. These days are tools given by God to help us draw closer to Him and to each other. And if we go back to Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14, after saying that we should see the Sabbath as a delight, it goes on to enhance the focus of that comment, saying, in effect, that if we're putting aside our own everyday affairs, making the Sabbath a special time, then, and this is the important part, then we'll be finding our actual, real delight in the eternal God. So in the end, this isn't really about a day or something physical or technical observances, but about our relationship with Almighty God and each other. The day simply enhances our view as it was meant to do. We can and should use these tools and treasure them to help enable each other in our walk through this life. These gatherings, when we're able to have them, may not be under the ideal circumstances we'd prefer. But that ultimate day is coming. In the meantime, we can use them to help build each other up, to counter this life's efforts to beat us all down. We can always strive, and I think we do, to make the Sabbath a time of upbuilding, of encouragement, a time for comforting one another, giving each other a safe respite from this world, learning how to be the supportive family that God intends us to be. And in the process, just as a sidebar for humility's sake, we need to remember something else, something so obvious that we usually look right past it. Not speaking of Jesus when he walked the earth, speaking humanly. No one has ever gotten this just right. The old saying goes that you never learn anything by doing it right. We learn by our mistakes. Oscar Wilde, who isn't the greatest person to quote, but he said many interesting things. Oscar Wilde said that nothing worth knowing can ever be taught. We learn by doing. We learn as we go. And like the scriptures said about our brother Jesus, unfortunately, we also have to learn by what we suffer. In this world, this age, the Sabbath will almost never be, for us, what it was really meant to be. But it will be. And we're looking for that promise, that future reality for ourselves and for all mankind. We can't know the full rest of God in this life. Our lifestyle will always be a stumbling block, and it always has been. But that doesn't mean we can't reach through it after a fashion and realize that in each Sabbath and holy day, God is giving us a taste of what's to come. As the scriptures have shown us, we've begun to enter that rest. And we can keep learning how to help each other move closer to it. And that brings me full circle. So I can say again what I was saying at the beginning. I truly hope you're having a very good Sabbath day.